This is Spectre hosts Tom Theophanis and Scott Jordan.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Spectre Radio Network on BBS Radio 2. I'm Scott Jordan, and remember, there's no such thing as too much information. We have Edgar Fouche, retired U.S. Air Force and defense contractor, with us tonight. He is the author of the book Alien Rapture and a special guest on alienscientist.com forum. Edgar, or Ed as his friends call him, came out and made his first disclosure back in 1998. He was the first one to describe how the TR-3B flying triangle, or Astra, and its purpose, as well as other classified aircraft and technology. His sole purpose is to get information out to people, and he is not promoting or selling anything. Hello, Ed.
Yes, hello, Scott.
How you doing? Nice to talk to you.
Well, it's always fun to talk to you.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a bit of your history, your military history, the sort of events that happened leading up to the writing of Alien Rapture, and what got you involved in all of that. So what was it in your past, just as a quick outline for your military history leading up to all of these events? And quite possibly, I remember stories in the book that were of there were younger events involved. The lead character, I would assume, is you.
Yes, I'm Joe Green.
You're Joe Green. Okay. So there is events as a young boy that happened with Joe Green, and so maybe we'll have to go back further.
The story leading up to Joe Green as an adult in the book has a lot of backstory about when he was a child. And I've had a lot of just weird and unexplainable things happen throughout my life, especially growing up. And I really have never talked about it in public until recently on my Fearful YouTube channel. I started disclosing these tales because I didn't want to confuse people with my public speaking, talking about black technology and secret programs. And I didn't want to confuse people with thinking, well, he's just another alien nut. And I'm not. I mean, I assume there are aliens. I very strongly assume that. But I didn't want my story about talking about the flying triangle and other vehicles and technology to be confused with strange experiences I had as a child. For example, in the book, I talk about little Joe Green down in Georgia in the early morning hours before sunset out trying to shoot rabbits in the cornfield, and then the sun came up from the wrong direction. There was this huge bright orb, which at the time I assumed was the sun. And then I blacked out, and, right after sunset, my Uncle Junior came looking for me, and I was standing there just staring to the west, and he grabbed me and shook me, and I never did recall exactly what happened. In fact, for many, many years, I had suppressed most of my childhood memories. So when I first started talking to my friends, we met out in Las Vegas in the early 90s, and we were talking about different black programs, and I happened to mention the triangle, and of course every one of them knew about it, and we really were very upset with the government for suppressing technology that would revolutionize energy and make power more available at a cheaper cost, and the flight characteristics of the magnetic field disruptor that would also revolutionize transportation. So they agreed, since I was the only writer in the group, that I would outline the stories and take their testimony and work it into the book. And they also introduced me to a few of their friends that wouldn't talk over the phone. And back then, we really didn't have hardly any internet. So I would travel around the country and talk to or interview these people. And So we started building the story from that point. And then we got to the point where I had a draft, and I added the backstory. The character Joe Green was the protagonist, the star of the book, so to speak. And so we started adding this backstory of my own personal happenings, because Joe Green is kind of a haunted person that has these visions and interactions with these voices in his head, and these turns out to be aliens, and they're kind of his mentor and bring him through a kind of a transition period. So we ended up having a story put together loosely around 95. And then in 96, I contacted Bob Silverstein, Quicksilver Literary Agency, and he was excited about the book. And he said, well, you're an unknown, and you also need a little polish to your book. He says, I'm going to recommend Brad Steigersman, your co-author. Well, back then I didn't care if I gave away half the book to a co-author, because I didn't do it for the money. My sole purpose was to get the information out there.
Right.
And I had talked to several judge, advocate, general lawyers to know exactly, where that gray line was I didn't want to step across. And then their advice was, if I told people it was secondhand information or third-hand, and then I wrote it as fiction, I could pretty damn well much write, whatever I wanted.
Right, that's true. So the characters in the book, they're based on, all of the characters in the book are based on people that you know, and these original people that you were met and had talked to and were angry about the suppression of the technology that should be out in the public.
Yes, there are a couple exceptions. The background officers, like at Groom Air Base, were fictional. One was General Buharnas, was mostly a composite of Colonel Sullivan, one of the greatest officers I ever served under. The wife and kid were fictional. Agabar, the torturer, was actually a composite of different stories I heard from CIA friends about how they had trained these interrogators for South America and European countries, and in the School of Americas, I believe it was, and other places. So the stories about Agabar, the torturer, although I believe were true, he was not a real person.
Right.
However, the NSA assassin, M.D. Crawford, was a real person. I knew most my adult life from the time I went in the military. His real name was Michael Crawford.
Oh, okay.
And the funny thing about him, he even though he did the dirty work for the agency, I'm sure there were others like him. He's the only one I knew that did that type of work. He thought he was a super patriot. He felt like somebody's got to do the dirty work.
And when you say that, you mean wet work?
Yes, well...
Assassinations.
Yes. That he felt like somebody, needed to do that to protect America, and he did not see himself as a killer or murderer. He had a job, and he was extremely good at it. Of course, everybody I talked to about him, thought basically he was made up. And then one day after Rebecca and I got married in 96, a guy calls up on the phone. He goes, who's this? And she says, well, who's calling? And he says, it's none of your business. He says, where's Ed? He says, well, she says, well, I'm Ed's wife. And he said, hell, I didn't know he got remarried. So anyway, Rebecca Brains walks into my study, and I pick up the extension, and I pointed to her to stay on, and we started talking. And then at some point, she realized that M.D. Crawford in the book was the guy I was talking to. And her jaw just literally dropped to the ground, and he wanted a draft of the book. And I got his current address and told him I'd send it to him. And he says, did you use my name in the book? And I said, no, I used M.D. Crawford. And he says, well, I want you to use my real name. And I said, I can't do that. Lawyers won't let me do that. And I said, why on earth would you want somebody to know your real name? He says, because I want my daughters and grandkids to know that I was a patriot. And, of course, to me that was very odd. And his interpretation of what he did. So only recently have I started talking about real names, like Jerry Elric, who was one of my friends that gave me information. He got up a couple years ago. He was 54, I think. Went to the bathroom, died of a heart attack. And then there was Bob Cullen, Allied Signal Bendix, that I first met at Edwards and then Nellis. He was a rep, factory rep, and he gave me information on some of these black programs. And he called me up one afternoon and says, Ed, I've been having all this numbness and tingling and blurred vision, and I went to the doctor, and I've got a brain tumor on my brain stem, and they can't operate or do chemo. So from the time he started having the symptoms to the night he died, I was the last one that talked to him on the phone before he passed away that night. In less than a month, he was dead. There was also Paige Gray from ITT, based out of Nutley, New Jersey. And same thing happened to him. He was in perfect health, started getting sicker, went to the hospital, died within a week.
And again, these are characters that you wrote in this book.
They're characters that fed me information, plus I used composites of some of their personalities in the book.
Right, okay.
So, for example, there was a classified dive I was on when I was stationed in Okinawa to retrieve the equipment code books off a sunken Russian trawler, and Russian trawlers were notorious spy ships loaded with radar and intercept and communications equipment. One went down in a storm, and then the NSA satellites tracked it, and we went on a dive and to drop transponders so that once we located it, the submarine could go in there with a deep submersible and start retrieving equipment. Now, the head of the dive team was also in charge of FIBA's, Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service. The NSA always called it Information Service, but it was actually, the NSA name was Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service. And the guy that was in charge there, his name was Rostislav Yukov. Now, in the book, I call him Cherkov, but everything about him was the real Rostislav Yukov, and he was a white Russian defector, I think from either Georgia or Ukraine, and his grandfather was a famous Russian general. And Rostislav was in charge of the dive. And then there's one person, Owen McKeon, on the book, which is actually a composite of two people. One of the people was a CIA friend, and the other person was an SR-71 pilot. So the Owen and McKeon are actually two personalities kind of merged. And then, of course, M.D. Crawford on the dive was Michael Crawford. So, these, like I said, these characters in the book are either composites of people I knew, in a couple of cases, people I heard about. When Joe Green gets to Medina Lake in San Antonio to talk to Dr. Farr, well, the real doctor's name was Parr.
Ah, okay.
Worked at Southwest Research. And he did have a cabin. I've been in it exactly where we talk about. It's loaded with high-tech equipment. Almost everything that I wrote about, and when Joe Green returned to San Antonio to talk to Farr at Medina Lake, it's almost 100% accurate